The sun shone with suspicious cheer over the village of High Welham, casting golden warmth on the bunting-strung hedges and perfectly pruned rose beds. It was the kind of day one might call idyllic, if not for the undercurrent of competition that pulsed beneath the chatter of tea-sipping matrons and long-gazing gentlemen. Dovecote House, the largest and most ostentatious estate in the village, was playing host to the annual High Welham Garden Society summer party, cherished, if subtly combative, tradition. Garden benches had been draped with floral cushions. Tiered trays groaned under the weight of cucumber sandwiches and Victoria sponge, and Lady Diana Reeves, the hostess, presided over it all like a queen surveying her dominion. Miss Jane Marple, a neat figure in lavender, sat near the herbaceous border beneath a striped parasol. A plate of lemon drizzle rested untouched on her lap as she nodded benignly at the steady parade of villagers greeting her. She was not a member of the garden society herself. Her own roses were far too modest for such glory, but she was a reliable presence at its functions. Indeed, as several villagers whispered, it simply wouldn't feel proper without her quiet knitting and politely disarming questions. The talk of the party, aside from the tragic pruning accident that had befallen Reverend Chiswick's clematis, was a guest of honor Sir Geoffrey Oxley, noted collector, amateur historian, and something of a celebrity in the region thanks to his televised lecture series on mysteries of the British Empire. Sir Geoffrey, with his shock of white hair and gold-rimmed spectacles, stood beside Lady Diana's prized lavender bush, holding court with a glass of sherry and an ivory figurine displayed prominently on a velvet cloth. It was a curious piece, no more than 6 inches tall, carved into the form of a crouching figure with exaggerated limbs and an inscrutable expression. This, Sir Geoffrey announced, is a ceremonial icon from the Beanie Kingdom, acquired by my great-uncle during his military expedition in 1897. Quite rare, quite valuable. The villagers murmured in awe, though some, like Colonel Seagrave, grunted with thinly veiled skepticism. Bit grim for a garden party, muttered Mrs. Dalton, the butcher's wife. Looks like something one might dig up in a cursed tomb, Lady Diana beamed. But Geoffrey insists it's a talking piece, and he's donating it to the Historical Society for a special exhibit. Aren't you, darling? Sir Geoffrey inclined his head, clearly pleased. Indeed, though my housekeeper is convinced it brings ill luck. He laughed a bit too loudly. The poor woman refused to dust it. A gust of wind ruffled the velvet cloth. Miss Marple, still knitting, glanced up briefly at the figurine. Her pale eyes lingered just a moment longer than might be expected before returning to her needles. And then, quite without warning, a shriek cut across the hum of conversation. It came from the drawing room. Guests surged toward the open French doors, teacups forgotten. Miss Marple rose, carefully setting down her knitting and following the current of the crowd with the air of one who had seen enough village dramas to know when to arrive after the worst had already happened. Inside, Lady Diana's housemaid, Elsie, stood frozen by the mahogany drinks cabinet, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other pointed, trembling, toward the floor. There, crumpled against the edge of the hearthrug, lay Sir Geoffrey Oxley. Motionless, his sherry glass lay shattered beside him, the deep burgundy of the wine staining the pale carpet like a spreading wound, and beneath his splayed hand his fingers curled as if reaching was the ivory figurine. Toppled from his perch, it was said later that it was Colonel Seagrave who muttered the word first. Dead. There was a gasp. Someone dropped a teacup. Miss Marple said nothing at all. She only stepped forward, peering down at the contorted figure of the man who had claimed to unlock ancient curses and forgotten truths. Sand had now, it seemed, become the center of a mystery himself. By the following morning, the death of Sir Geoffrey Oxley had reached every corner of High Welham, carried on the swift, sure wings of gossip. Not even the milkman could deliver his bottles without being quizzed for details, nor the vicar leave his garden without encountering speculative whispers, thinly disguised as condolences. The official word of her by Constable Ned Tilling, a good-natured but easily flustered young man, was that Sir Geoffrey had collapsed suddenly. The attending doctor, summoned from Lower Marchford, had muttered something vague about the heart, but no death certificate had yet been issued. That, in itself, was enough to feed speculation. Collapsed, sniffed Mrs. Dalrymple, who ran the village haberdashery and fancied herself a connoisseur of both lace and intrigue. Men like that don't simply collapse. He was in fine form not 10 minutes before, holding court like Caesar in a conservatory. At the Bluebell Tea Room, the talk circled like bees around jam tarts. "I heard it was poison," whispered Mavis Gullett, lowering her voice dramatically. "In his drink. That sherry," said it turned his lips blue. "Don't be ridiculous," replied Mrs. Purdy, the baker's wife. "He was just old, overexcited. That horrid little statue probably gave him the vapors. The tea, that horrid little statue, as it turned out, had vanished by mid-morning." Word had spread that the ivory figurine, a supposed ceremonial icon from Sir Geoffrey's collection, had not been among his personal effects when the constable arrived. Lady Diana, pale and visibly shaken, had declared she remembered seeing it fall during the commotion. But when she looked again, it had gone. "Gone," repeated. "Yes, gone," replied the vicar's wife solemnly. "Vanished. As though it had never been there at all." Miss Marple, who had been quietly sipping her tea at her usual corner table by the window, made no comment, but she had noted something curious even before the disappearance had been made public: the reaction on Charlotte Farlow's face. Charlotte, Lady Diana's companion and secretary of sorts, was a woman of about 30, with a severe bun and careful speech, the sort who seldom spoke unless spoken to and rarely smiled unless it was required. Yet Miss Marple, ever the observer, had seen her freeze for half a second not when Sir Geoffrey fell. But when the figurine hit the floor, the memory returned with clarity. A flash of fear quickly buried. Miss Marple had learned long ago that fear was always more telling than grief. Later that day, under a soft drizzle that muted the clink of teacups and made the cobbles shine like wet stone, Miss Marple took a slow and seemingly casual walk to the post office. The postmistress, Miss Henrietta Green, was busy sorting envelopes behind the counter, but her ears, like many in High Wellham, were fine-tuned to scandal. "Terrible business, Ski," she said as Miss Marple approached. "Lady Diana hasn't left the house. The doctor's been twice. To say the Historical Society exhibit is postponed indefinitely." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple replied mildly. "A shock to everyone, I'll say." Miss Green went on. "And that poor Medelsi, is it? She swears she saw the figurine after the fall. But Constable Tilling says it wasn't there when he arrived. Between you and me, I think someone took it." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Would explain why such an ugly little thing has caused so much fuss." Miss Green leaned in. "Do you suppose it was cursed, as Sir Geoffrey said?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I've never had much patience for curses, but I do find people behave very oddly around objects they believe hold power." She collected her stamps, thanked the postmistress, and stepped back out into the drizzle as she walked home past the allotments and the war memorial. Her thoughts unfolded in a quiet stream. Sir Geoffrey had boasted about the figurine. That much was certain. He had drawn attention to it, placed it on display, and ensured everyone understood its value: historical, its financial, and, to some minds, supernatural. Then he had died suddenly, conveniently, and then the object had disappeared. It was not difficult to connect the dots. But Miss Marple did not believe in accidents, nor, despite her gentle nature, did she believe in coincidence. She believed in people, and people, when frightened, did all manner of foolish things. That evening, the inquest was formally postponed, the coroner, citing irregularities in Sir Geoffrey's medical history and the sudden nature of his collapse, insisted on a post-mortem. It was a word that sent a fresh shiver through the village. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting in her lap, and thought again of Charlotte Farlow. She thought, too, of Lady Diana's sudden evasiveness, of the maid's pale face, and of a brief conversation overheard at the edge of the rose garden, the one between Colonel Seagrave and the vicar. He was bluffing. "That's all I'm saying," the colonel had muttered. "Bluffing about that will. He said he'd changed it, but you know the type, he'd like to wave things about. You ask me, he never filed a thing. He changed will." Now that was interesting. Miss Marple reached for her notebook and made a small, precise entry. The next morning, a knock came at her door. When she opened it, she found Charlotte Farlow standing in the early light, her gloved hands trembling slightly. I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "I wondered if I might speak with you. Just for a moment." Miss Marple stepped aside with a quiet nod. "Of course, my dear. Come in." As Charlotte entered the sitting room, she hesitated, her gaze flitting toward the hearth, the floral wallpaper, the gently steaming teapot. "It's just something's not right," she said at last. "About what happened? About Sir Geoffrey." Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea, her expression calm. "I quite agree." Charlotte Farlow sat upright in the chintz armchair opposite Miss Marple, her posture stiff, her gloved hands wrapped tightly around the teacup. Her face, though pale, was composed, but Miss Marple noticed the subtle tension in her jaw, the slight tremor as she raised the cup to her lips. "I'm not sure why I came," Charlotte said at last, her voice careful, practiced. "Perhaps just to speak to someone who wasn't part of it all." Miss Marple gave her a kind, non-committal smile. "It can be helpful, dear. A fresh set of ears, especially when one finds oneself tangled in a most unpleasant event." Charlotte hesitated. "I've known Lady Diana since I was a girl. She was a friend of my mother's. I started helping with the house after my father died. It's never been easy, but I owe her a great deal." "Of course," Miss Marple said gently. "She speaks very highly of you." A slight frown touched Charlotte's brow. "Does she? I'm never quite sure. She has a way of, well, she forgets people, sometimes. Even the ones standing beside her." Miss Marple said nothing, letting the silence draw out just a beat longer than comfort allowed. "I only meant," Charlotte continued, setting her teacup down too quickly, "that sometimes people assume I know more than I do about Sir Geoffrey. For instance." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did you?" There was a pause. "Not really," Charlotte said at last. "He visited often over the years. Always charming, always full of stories. But I don't believe he ever told the same one twice. I think he liked the attention more than the truth." "Did you see him arguing with anyone that day?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild. Charlotte hesitated, eyes flickering. "Not exactly arguing. There was some tension, I suppose. Colonel Seagrave seemed on edge. He didn't like Sir Geoffrey. Said something under his breath when the figurine was being shown. Something about cheap theater, but that was all." Miss Marple nodded. "And you, Miss Farlow? How did you feel about the figurine?" Charlotte blinked. "I don't know what you mean. I imagine you heard the stories. The curse, it's a superstition." Charlotte gave a short laugh, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That sort of thing is nonsense, isn't it?" "Some nonsense has teeth," Miss Marple said gently, "especially if enough people believe in it." Another silence stretched between them. Then, unexpectedly, Charlotte leaned forward. "Do you think someone killed him?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She lifted her cup, sipped her tea, and set it down with care. "I think," she said slowly, "that Sir Geoffrey died rather too conveniently, and that the object which most preoccupied him, this figurine, disappeared just as conveniently. I think it's possible that someone in that drawing room wanted him silenced, or frightened, or both. Charlotte's eyes widened, but not in surprise. More like recognition. I have to go, she said suddenly, rising to her feet. Thank you for the tea, Miss Marple. I don't know what I was hoping to find by coming here. Sometimes, Miss Marple replied softly, we simply need to hear the sound of the truth, even if we can't say it ourselves. Charlotte paused, one gloved hand resting on the doorknob. He said, she whispered, that he was going to change the will, that someone who had never expected anything was going to be very surprised. And then she was gone. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat with the local doctor, Leonard Emmett, in the snug of the Bluebell Inn. He was a gruff, methodical man, but fond of Miss Marple and used to her odd, precise inquiries. I can't say I like this business, he said, stirring his tea with unnecessary vigor. Sir Geoffrey was perfectly fit the last time I examined him. No signs of anything troubling. His heart, lungs, blood pressure, all sound. And yet, Miss Marple said, he was dead within moments of taking a sip of sherry. The doctor frowned. That's the curious part. There were no obvious signs of poisoning, no convulsions, no foam at the mouth, nothing dramatic. But I've requested a toxicology report regardless. Something in his system may not have agreed with him or been placed there deliberately. Miss Marple murmured. Dr. Emmett looked at her sharply. You think someone poisoned him? I think, she replied, that someone removed a figurine because they feared what might come after its discovery. He frowned. Kay, you're suggesting the figurine had something hidden inside it? Not necessarily, Miss Marple said. Kay, but people sometimes project their fears onto objects, especially when those objects are said to be cursed. The doctor grunted. You think someone panicked? I think someone acted. And panic often makes people do very peculiar things. Oh. That evening, the vicar's wife hosted a small gathering at the rectory, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming harvest fair, but in truth, the conversation rarely left the topic of Sir Geoffrey's death. Colonel Seagrave was in attendance, pacing near the fireplace and nursing a whiskey. Mark my words, he said, Geoffrey was a fraud. He once claimed to have dined with the Emperor of Japan. Said it without blinking. He could charm the paint off a wall, but I never trusted him. Can what of the will? Asked Mrs. Purdy, her eyes bright. What indeed? Said the colonel, pausing mid-step. He claimed he was changing it, spoke of some generous gesture to the Historical Society. Oh, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was bluffing. Okay, trying to keep everyone eager for his approval. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting, said nothing. Okay. But she remembered Charlotte's words. Okay. Someone who had never expected anything. The next morning, as the village grocer unloaded crates of apples onto his stall, Elsie, the maid, appeared at Miss Marple's cottage, clutching something tightly in a handkerchief. I wasn't going to say anything, miss, she said breathlessly, but I couldn't sleep. Miss Marple motioned her inside. It's this, Elsie said, unwrapping the handkerchief. Inside lay a small, ivory fragmented, jagged piece, no more than a knuckle's width, with a smooth curve on one side and a faint, sharp edge on the other. It was under the drinks cabinet, she whispered. I found it when I was cleaning, the morning after. Miss Marple took it delicately. Did you tell anyone? No, miss. I didn't want Lady Diana to think I'd broken something, but something's not right. Marple said gently, turning the fragment in the light. Something certainly is not. Rain had returned to High Welham, light and persistent, softening the outlines of the thatched cottages and making the narrow lanes glisten like silk ribbon. Most villagers remained indoors, watching the mist roll through the hedgerows from behind steamed-up windows. It was the sort of day that encouraged reflection or, for Miss Marple's investigation. The ivory fragment left by young Elsie now sat on a small dish atop of Miss Marple's sewing table, beside a magnifying glass and a pencil. In the morning light, the shard was even more peculiar than she'd first noticed. While the curvature was consistent with the figurine's rounded edges, the break was not clean. The fracture bore a splintered edge, and most curiously, fine brown residue clung to one corner. Miss Marple examined it through the lens. It was not dust, nor dirt. It was something sticky, dried like the remnants of glue. She folded her hands. Something had been affixed to the figurine, or perhaps hidden inside. There had been rumors, of course, that Sir Geoffrey believed the figurine was more than it appeared. He'd implied as much in his speech, spinning tales of colonial secrets and ceremonial idols. The villagers had laughed, nodded, dismissed it as showmanship. But what if it hadn't been an act? What if Sir Geoffrey truly had discovered something inside the ivory and someone else knew it? That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the Historical Society. The building, once a schoolhouse, was tucked behind the green. A modest stone structure with ivy-clad walls and creaky wooden floors. Inside, the air smelled of parchment and dust. Miss Pettingle, the society's elderly curator, greeted her with a distracted smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, we've been in a state, haven't we? It's dreadful business with poor Sir Geoffrey, and a figurine such a loss. Key had promised to loan it to us, you know, had an entire case prepared." "Was the exhibit already catalogued?" Miss Marple asked innocently. "Oh yes, Sir Geoffrey was quite precise, brought the paperwork himself." Miss Pettingle bustled over to a narrow filing cabinet and produced a slim folder. Miss Marple leafed through the contents. Descriptions, provenance, photographs. But one line stood out. Crouching figure. Hollow core suspected. Sealed base resin or adhesive. Owner believes hidden compartment may exist. No damage permitted. Miss Marple's brow lifted just a fraction. She closed the file gently. "And do you know if he had it examined?" Pettingle hesitated. "He mentioned someone in Londina, Mr. Ashdown, I believe, an antiquities specialist. But I don't think it ever left his possession. He was quite possessive of it." "Really?" "Carried it in a velvet pouch." "And he never told you what he believed was hidden inside?" "No, only that it had weight. Not physical weight, you understand. Importance." Miss Marple returned to the village with her suspicions confirmed. Sir Geoffrey believed the figurine contained a secret. And at least one other person, perhaps more, knew it too. That evening, she hosted a small gathering at her cottage under the pretense of a modest supper. Lady Diana Reeves arrived with forced cheer, though her eyes remained hollowed with fatigue. Charlotte Farlow followed closely behind, subdued. Colonel Seagrave declined, but sent word through the vicar's wife that he would speak with Miss Marple privately, and when the weather was less conducive to pneumonia. Dr. Emmett joined as well, nodding solemnly over his sherry. "Still waiting on toxicology results," he murmured. "These things take time. London's been slow since the rail strike." Conversation remained strained until Miss Marple, with her usual softness, turned it toward the figurine. "It's a shame, really," she said lightly, "that such a peculiar piece should vanish entirely. I'd hoped someone might have found it behind a cushion. It was knocked over, wasn't it?" Lady Diana nodded vaguely. "Yes, fell when Geoffrey collapsed. I remember seeing it on the floor." "But not after?" Miss Marple asked gently. Lady Diana hesitated. "Okay. No, I assumed someone picked it up." Charlotte sipped her tea, saying nothing. Dr. Emmett looked between them. "You think it was taken deliberately?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that a great deal of noise was made that day, and people tend not to notice what vanishes in the noise." Charlotte's cup rattled faintly as she set it down. Miss Marple turned to her. "I wonder, my dear, whether Sir Geoffrey ever spoke to you in private about the figurine. Perhaps hinted at a change in his affairs." Charlotte's eyes flickered, but her voice was steady. Only once, a few days before the party, he said he'd made a new will, that certain people had been adjusted. I assumed he meant Lady Diana. They weren't especially close, despite appearances. Lady Diana stiffened, color rising in her cheeks. I hosted him. He was an old friend of my late husband. What was I to do? Turn him away? No, Charlotte said quickly. Of course not. I didn't mean, but the tension in the room had shifted. Miss Marple waited. Lady Diana, suddenly very still, set down her fork. There was a letter, she said quietly. Everyone looked at her after Jeffrey died. I didn't mention it seemed to sort it, but it came 2 days after. No return address. Just a single line. It's not the will you think it is. Later that night, Miss Marple sat by her fire and considered the weight of that anonymous letter. Someone had wanted Lady Diana to doubt her standing, perhaps even provoke a confrontation. But more importantly, he confirmed that someone else knew about the new will, and if Jeffrey had hidden it somewhere, perhaps inside the figurine, would explain both his sudden death and the object's convenient disappearance. But that raised the question, who had the most to lose if that will had indeed been changed? Miss Marple stood and went to her bureau. From it, she removed the ivory fragment Elsie had brought her. Then she took up a thin brass pin from her sewing kit and scraped gently at the dried residue on the broken edge. The faint scent that rose was unmistakable resin, so the figurine had been sealed and cracked open, and someone in High Welham had opened it before it was ever displayed at the garden party, which meant the missing figurine wasn't taken in panic. It was taken to cover up what had already been done. The following morning dawned gray and thick with fog, the kind of clinging mist that blurred edges and encouraged secrets to linger in hedgerows. High Welham, with its hedged lanes and weather-worn fences, seemed more hushed than usual. The village went about its quiet routines. Milk bottles collected, shutters opened. Dogs walked. There remained a sense that something beneath the surface had shifted. Miss Marple had already risen. Her breakfast tray, half-eaten, rested beside a small satchel in which he had packed the ivory shard, the sewing pin, and her notebook. She tied her scarf neatly under her chin and set out, boots crunching lightly on the gravel, bound for her first stop of the day. The Vicarage. Reverend Lionel Aldersby was a gentleman with a fondness for rhubarb and a tendency to ramble during sermons. But he was also, Miss Marple knew, the village's most trusted confidant, someone who heard things not meant for the ear of a policeman. I wonder, she said, as they sat over tea in the vicar's study, if you recall any mention of Sir Geoffrey's will. He was a man with a strong sense of theater. I imagine he liked to stir expectations, Reverend Aldersby considered. He did mention it to me, quite vaguely, a few weeks before his death. Said he was correcting old debts. Curious turn of phrase. At the time, I assumed it was about finances. Did he say where he kept his affairs? I believe he had a solicitor in Market Dean, but more recently he mentioned keeping important items close, hidden in plain sight, he said. I thought it a poetic musing. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And yet the figurine disappears. A sealed object, a vanished will. It hardly feels poetic now, does it? From the vicarage, Miss Marple walked to Dovecote House. Lady Diana Reeves received her with a stiffness that belied her usual charm. She was dressed impeccably, as always, though her eyes betrayed a fatigue deeper than sleep could mend. I've had no appetite, she confessed, leading Miss Marple into the sunroom. And it's not just the loss of Geoffrey, it's the insinuations, the whispers. Miss Marple settled herself, knitting in her lap, though the needles remained still. You've lived with expectations for a long time, my dear, I imagine. Geoffrey represented something more than old acquaintance. Lady Diana didn't answer at first. Then, my husband always admired him, said Geoffrey would do the honorable thing by us one day. I think I held on to that idea longer than I ought to. You believed you'd be remembered in his will. Lady Diana looked away. It wasn't about money. It was about place, about mattering. After all the years I spent hosting him, fussing over his lectures, arranging rooms, tea, and when he hinted he'd changed it, I felt uneasy, but I didn't ask. I thought it best not to appear grasping until the letter arrived. Yes, her voice dropped. I haven't told anyone else? Miss Marple watched her over the rim of her teacup. Tell me, did Geoffrey ever confide in Charlotte Farlow? Lady Diana gave a tight smile. Oh, Charlotte. She was always the useful one. Quiet, efficient, grateful. She did everything that needed doing without needing to be seen. Yet, Miss Marple said softly, I suspect she saw more than anyone. Lady Diana looked sharply at her, then stood. She's been strange since the party. Distant, distracted. Yes, Miss Marple said, rising, as though carrying the weight of something broken. She found Charlotte not at Dovecote House, but in the village library, seated at a back table with an open book before her and ink smudged on one finger. Her face was pale, her eyes hollowed by something more than sleeplessness. You found something? Miss Marple said, by way of greeting. Charlotte looked up, startled. Kay, Miss Marple sat opposite her. You found the new will, didn't you? There was a long silence. Then, with trembling hands, Charlotte slid a folded document from the inside pocket of her coat. I found it the morning after, she whispered, inside a false compartment in the writing desk in the guest room. Drawer had a hidden lock I only knew to look because I once helped Sir Geoffrey unpack and noticed the drawer was shorter than it should be. And a figurine? Miss Marple asked gently. Charlotte hesitated. I found it broken before the party. I think Sir Geoffrey dropped it. There was resin and fragments. I gathered them, intending to tell him. But then I found the will. I saw my name. Voice cracked. I was one of the beneficiaries. He'd left me money. Not much, but something. It meant he'd seen me, not just as a girl fetching coats, but as someone who mattered. Miss Marple nodded. And then he died. I panicked, Charlotte confessed. I thought if the figurine was meant to hold the will and it was broken, someone might accuse me, or worse, Lady Diana would contest it. She was always watching. I took the will and hid it. I don't even know what became of the figurine after the party. I didn't take it. Miss Marple reached across the table and took her hand gently. I believe you, but hiding the will has only deepened the mystery. Charlotte looked up with tears in her eyes. Do you think someone killed him? Miss Marple's voice was calm. Yes, I do. And I believe the motive was not just fear of exposure, but the loss of entitlement. That evening, the post arrived late, brought by the grocer's boy due to the regular carrier's illness. Among the usual envelopes was one hand addressed to Miss Marple, no return address, but with an unmistakable, deliberate hand. Inside was a single sheet. The figurine was hollow. You were right. But what was hidden inside wasn't just a will. It was a secret, one Geoffrey would never have wanted revealed. Miss Marple read the line twice. Then she fetched her notebook and made a final entry under motives, legacy, entitlement, secrets, and, lastly, fear of being replaced. The fog that had lingered like an unwelcome guest finally lifted the following morning, revealing High Welham in a stark, pale light. The trees looked brittle against the sky, their bare branches tracing patterns like veins against the mist-bleached clouds. It was a morning that seemed to carry meaning, as though something long hidden were now ready to surface. Miss Marple, wrapped in a charcoal-gray shawl and with a satchel over her arm, walked through the village with her usual unhurried tread. Her destination, the solicitor's office in Market Dean, some 6 miles away. She had sent a discreet inquiry the day before regarding Sir Geoffrey Oxley's testamentary documents. The response had arrived promptly that morning. Mr. Ralston, the solicitor in question, would be pleased to meet with her at 11 sharp. It was not curiosity that compelled Miss Marple, nor any hunger for scandal. It was a quiet obligation to truth, particularly when it seemed to be hiding behind politeness and paperwork. The office, nestled between a tea shop and a funeral director, was narrow, neat, and faintly scented of old books and lemon polish. Mr. Ralston, a florid-faced man with pince-nez and a thinning comb-over, greeted her with professional reserve. "Ah, Miss Marple, a pleasure. I've heard of your skill with puzzles." She smiled demurely. "Only of the domestic kind, Mr. Ralston. But I do have a question or two, if I may." Of course. I understand you were present at the unfortunate garden party." "I was indeed," she said, accepting a cup of tea. "And I understand Sir Geoffrey made some adjustments to his will not long before his death." Ralston pursed his lips. "Yes, a revised document was filed in my office only 10 days prior." He was in high spirits when he brought it and spoke of righting old wrongs, I believe. There were several new additions, though nothing one would call shocking. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Might I ask who was removed?" Ralston hesitated. "Well, Lady Diana Reeves, for one. She had been to a modest bequest under a prior version. In the revised document, that bequest was rescinded and added. Miss Charlotte Farlow, his goddaughter, received a new provision, as did a Mr. Ashdown, a London antiques dealer, and curiously some was allocated to the High Welham Historical Society for the care and exhibition of a culturally significant artifact. The figurine, I presume, was a copy of the will sent to Sir Geoffrey." Ralston shook his head. "No, he refused. Said he didn't trust the post or the people around him. He insisted I keep it in our vault. I was to release it only upon his death. But then Miss Marple said someone else believed there was another will, hidden, perhaps, within the figurine. Or perhaps they feared one would be found." Ralston blinked. "I hadn't considered that." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Most people don't, until it's too late." By the time Miss Marple returned to High Welham that afternoon, the village was once again alive with whispers. News had traveled quickly. Lady Diana had been summoned to speak with Inspector Cray. Nothing formal, of course, just routine questioning, but the suggestion was enough. At the Bluebell Tea Room, speculation buzzed louder than the milk frother. "She was furious when she found out about the will," said Mrs. Purdy, carefully buttering a scone. "I heard she told the vicar that Geoffrey had betrayed her." "Betrayed, indeed," huffed Mr. Jessup, the greengrocer. "I never trusted her little soirees. Too much French cheese. It's always a sign of trouble." That Miss Marple, passing through with a small basket of groceries, made no comment, but she noted the shift in tone. Just days ago, Lady Diana had been the village's grieving hostess. Now, she was teetering on the edge of suspicion. Due to evidence, there was none but because of story. In villages like High Welham, narrative was often more powerful than truth. Inspector Cray arrived at Miss Marple's cottage not long after sundown. He looked weary, his collar damp from rain, his eyes faintly rimmed with sleeplessness. "She's lying," he said, stepping inside without ceremony. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Lady Diana?" He nodded, removing his coat. "About her reaction to the new will. She claims she was shocked to hear she'd been cut out." "Huh? But I spoke with her housekeeper. Lady Diana had been ranting about Geoffrey's ingratitude for a week before the party. She knew." Miss Marple poured him tea. "Or suspected. She's got a temper. That much is clear, and she wasn't subtle about it." Miss Marple studied him. "But you're not convinced she killed him?" Cray shook his head. "I don't know. She had motive, but opportunity. Poison isn't easy. We're still waiting for the final report. But Dr. Emmett is certain It wasn't a natural death. No sign of stroke or cardiac failure. There was something in that, Sherry. Perhaps not in the glass at all, Miss Marple murmured. Perhaps it was in the bottle. Cray looked up. Miss Marple continued. Sir Geoffrey poured his own drink. Did he not? According to the maid? Yes. So someone need only tamper with the bottle earlier? Cray frowned. It was brought from Lady Diana's cabinet. Locked. Only 2 people knew where the key was kept, Miss Marple said. Lady Diana and Charlotte Farlow. Cray fell silent. She admitted to me, Miss Marple said gently, that she found the will. That she saw her name and panicked. But I believe she feared being accused. Not because she was guilty, but because she was, in that moment, visible. And that frightened her more than anything. Cray rubbed his jaw. So who? Miss Marple stood and retrieved a folded paper. From her satchel the anonymous note that had arrived the day before. Cray read it twice. The figurine was hollow. It wasn't just a will. It was a secret Geoffrey would never have wanted revealed. Cray blinked. What secret? Miss Marple sat once more, folding her hands. I believe someone broke open the figurine days before the party. Possibly weeks. Sir Geoffrey dropped hints about its importance, its weight. But what if what was inside wasn't just a will? What if it was something embarrassing, damaging to his reputation, such as letter, Miss Marple said, or a journal, or a confession? Geoffrey liked his legend. Okay, he didn't want to be seen as weak or fallible. But what if someone else discovered it firsthand, used it as leverage? Cray narrowed his eyes. A Colonel Seagrave. Miss Marple's smile was unreadable. He was bitter, and Sir Geoffrey had humiliated him more than once. But no. I believe the killer was someone who cared deeply about their place. Someone who believed they were owed. Cray stared at her. Lady Diana, again? No, Miss Marple said. I believe it was someone who never expected anything till they thought just for a moment that they might receive everything. Cray said nothing. Miss Marple sipped her tea. We must invite them, she said softly, to reveal themselves. Cray stared. How? She smiled. With an object. That Sunday, a quiet invitation was sent to a small list of guests. Lady Diana, Charlotte Farlow, Colonel Seagrave, Dr. Emmett, and the vicar. The gathering would be held in the reading room of the Historical Society, where Miss Pettingle had agreed grudgingly to reopen the figurine exhibit as a tribute to Sir Geoffrey. At the center of the room, under a fresh display case, sat an ivory figurine, or rather, a near-exact replica. Miss Marple, with the help of Mr. Ralston and the Ashdown antiques dealer in London, had arranged for a duplicate to be placed. The real figurine, broken, emptied, and thoroughly examined, was safely hidden. This is the one they expect, she told Cray, and that expectation will draw the truth to us. Cray glanced around the room as the guests began to arrive. Will it work? Miss Marple gave him a look of supreme calm. Oh yes, because whoever took the figurine will know this is not the real one. And their reaction, she said, her eyes, already scanning the faces of the gathering, will be very telling indeed. The Historical Society reading room, usually reserved for parish records and gently foxed copies of The Gentlewoman, had never seen so many polished shoes or such perfectly subdued expressions. Beneath the low oak beams, a circle of chairs had been arranged with symmetrical precision, and at the center, lit gently from above, stood the new glass case. Within it, poised on the velvet cushion, the shade of old claret, was the ivory figurine. Or, more precisely, a very convincing replica, to the casual observer. It was identical, same posture, same elongated limbs, same eerie grin carved into the small, crouched figure. But to someone intimately familiar with the original, someone who had held it, studied it, broken its flaws, would be glaring. And it was precisely that recognition that Miss Marple was counting on. She sat in the back row of the room, knitting. In her lap, her eyes only rarely straying from her work. Yet her attention never wavered. Miss Marple had always found that people revealed more when they thought they weren't being watched. Inspector Cray stood near the door, arms crossed, taking silent note of every entry and every glance. He had his doubts. Of course, this was hardly orthodox procedure, but he trusted Miss Marple's instincts, however quietly deployed. The guests arrived in ones and twos. Lady Diana swept in first, dressed in gray silk, her lips set in a line too polished to be mournful. She took a seat near the case, casting only a single glance at the figurine before reaching for the tea tray. Colonel Seagrave, stiff and red-faced, grunted a greeting and settled heavily into a chair near the fireplace, where he proceeded to glare at everyone with equal suspicion. Dr. Emmett arrived with the vicar, murmuring something about digestive tinctures and the unpredictability of damp weather. Both men gave the case a glance, then exchanged polite comments about the velvet being a bit much. Then came Charlotte Farlow. She hesitated in the doorway just a moment too long, then stepped in, hands folded over her purse. Her eyes went immediately to the display and lingered. Miss Marple noted the pause. Charlotte took a seat beside the vicar and folded her hands again. They were trembling when Miss Pettingle rose to say a few words about Sir Geoffrey's legacy and the figurines. Historical context entirely fabricated for the occasion. Most of the room listened with polite disinterest, but a few watched each other. Miss Marple was not among the listeners. She was watching the watchers. The speech concluded with a modest smattering of applause. It was Miss Marple who broke the moment of silence that followed. "I wonder," she said in her calm, unhurried voice, "whether Sir Geoffrey ever told any of you what he thought the figurine truly meant." A ripple passed through the room, subtle but unmistakable. Colonel Seagrave scoffed. He made it up as he went. One week it was a fertility idol. The next it was cursed by some tribal priest. The man liked a bit of drama, did he? Marple asked, still knitting. "I suppose some would say so. But I rather think he liked to test people, to see how they reacted, much like the figurine itself." Lady Diana frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple looked up, her needles pausing. "You see, the figurine was broken before the party, not during it, as many assumed." Charlotte's eyes widened slightly. "It was broken," Miss Marple continued, "and inside it was a hidden compartment. Something was stored there, something Sir Geoffrey did not want known, but someone else found it. And that knowledge shifted everything." Double quotes. Dr. Emmett cleared his throat. "Do we know what it was?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "I do." Cray, standing near the door, straightened. He'd not heard this part. Yet Miss Marple rose slowly, her hand steady. "It was a letter," she said, "written by Sir Geoffrey during the war. Letter admitting that one of his academic discoveries, a set of artifacts he later sold for considerable profit, in fact been misappropriated from a private collection in Belgium during the German retreat. There was a collective intake of breath. It wasn't just a secret," she said. "It was a stain. A crack in the legend he'd carefully curated, one that could have destroyed his reputation." Colonel Seagrave sat up. "And you say someone found this?" Miss Marple nodded. "I believe they did. And I believe they used it to blackmail Sir Geoffrey, perhaps to ensure a change in the will, or to force a public confession, perhaps both." She stepped closer to the display case. But what they didn't expect was that Sir Geoffrey might fight back, that he might prepare to reveal the truth on his own terms. And so they did the unthinkable. She turned, her eyes sweeping the room. "They killed him." A brittle silence followed. Lady Diana's teacup rattled faintly on the saucer. "I didn't," she said suddenly. "I didn't even know about any letter." Miss Marple nodded. "No, I don't believe you did." "I certainly had motive," said Colonel Seagrave gruffly. but I'd rather have watched Jeffrey hang himself with his own rope than lift a finger to help him. Nor you, Miss Marple said, nodding. She turned her gaze on Charlotte. You, Miss Farlow, were the only one in the household with access to the figurine before the party. You discovered the hidden will, yes, but not the letter. Let had already been removed. Someone else had broken it before you. Charlotte swallowed hard. But who? Miss Marple stepped aside, gesturing to the display. There's only one person in this room who noticed that the figurine is not the original. All eyes turned toward the case. Its weight is off, Miss Marple said. The grain of the ivory, while expertly matched, lacks the distinctive crack that Sir Geoffrey himself pointed out in his last speech. She turned to face the room, and only Dr. Emmett reacted to that. The doctor blinked, his mouth opening, then closing. Again, you examined the figurine weeks before, Miss Marple said. Sir Geoffrey trusted you as his physician. He showed it to you privately, perhaps even asked your opinion on the hidden compartment, okay? And when you saw what was inside, what it could mean for his reputation, for the village, for the historical society, school's chairmanship, you coveted, you acted. Dr. Emmett rose to his feet. That's absurd. I've never even touched the thing. Cray stepped forward. Doctor, Miss Marple's voice was soft now. You're a man who has been quietly overlooked for years. Not quite important. Enough? Not quite remembered. Sir Geoffrey never respected you, did he? Emmett's voice was suddenly louder. He was a fraud. He didn't deserve to be remembered. And so you made sure, Miss Marple said, that he wouldn't be. Dr. Emmett's shoulders sagged. He was going to burn the letter, pretend it had never happened, sweep it under the rug, like everything else. He looked up, eyes glistening. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted to frighten him. I spiked the bottle just enough to make him ill, but he must have taken too much, or maybe his heart really was weak. Silence followed. Cray stepped forward and gently took the doctor's arm. It's done, he said. Miss Marple, still standing by the glass case, quietly resumed her knitting. The confession was taken. The case made its way, quietly, through the proper channels. In time, the village would speak of it in lower tones, allowing the memory to soften at the edges. Charlotte Farlow received her modest inheritance, and the Historical Society retained the replica figurine, while the real one was quietly retired. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her garden and her letters, and when the vicar's wife asked her, weeks later, whether she had ever truly believed in the curse, Miss Marple smiled. No, she said gently, but I believe in guilt. And that, dear, is far more dangerous. It was not a courtroom, nor even a proper drawing room, but the reading room of the High Weldham Historical Society felt like a stage that evening. Yep, stage upon which truths long buried had been coaxed into the light. The replica figurine still rested under its glass, now a strange and hollow token of the real mystery that had surrounded it. And seated around Miss Marple, Inspector Cray, and Dr. Emmett's no vacant chair. The remaining villagers looked dazed. Lady Diana sat stiffly, arms crossed, as if willing herself to be impervious to the implications of the last hour. Charlotte Farlow sat as though turned to stone, hands in her lap. Head bowed. Colonel Seagrave stood by the fireplace, utterly still. He had not spoken since the doctor's quiet confession. His eyes were sharp, watchful not from suspicion, but from comprehension. Inspector Cray, standing near the case, broke the silence. You all deserve to understand what happened, he said. And Miss Marple has offered to explain it as she's already explained it to me. He nodded toward her, and Miss Marple, still seated with her knitting, resting neatly in her lap, looked around the room with a gentle, unreadable expression. What I found, she said, is that most crimes in villages like ours are not born of evil. They come from fear, or pride, or desperation, and in this case, all three. She turned slightly in her chair, addressing the room not as an accuser, but as a guide, leading them down a path they had already begun to walk. Sir Geoffrey Oxley was, in many ways, a man built of stories. His identity, his prestige, was tied not just to his discoveries, but to the myth of his discoveries, and that myth was carefully cultivated. But inside that figurine, she gestured toward the case, was something that could unravel it all. She met their eyes, one by one, a letter written decades ago. It revealed that one of his most famous acquisitions was, in fact, taken under questionable circumstances. A looted artifact from Belgium during the war, passed off as a colonial find. The shame, the scandal. Geoffrey would have done anything to suppress it. Charlotte looked up, her face pale, but someone found it. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Dr. Emmett. Geoffrey trusted him perhaps because, as a man of science, he assumed the doctor would understand discretion. Dr. Emmett had grown tired of being overlooked, ignored, and more than that, he had ambition. He saw an opportunity to gain influence over Sir Geoffrey, perhaps even force a confession, or secure his own position within the society. Colonel Seagrave spoke for the first time, voice gruff, but Geoffrey wouldn't be threatened. No, Miss Marple agreed. He decided, I believe, to announce the truth on his own terms. Perhaps even during the garden party, hence the public unveiling of the figurine. He was preparing something theatrical perhaps, to claim he'd discovered the hidden compartment only recently. To control the narrative, as they say, Lady Diana scoffed. Kay and Emmett stopped him. Miss Marple said quietly, by poisoning the sherry bottle, a slow-acting toxin. Not one intended to kill immediately, but enough to make him collapse, frighten him into silence. But it went too far, Charlotte whispered. He died. Miss Marple's gaze softened. That is often the case with amateur poisoners. Too much or not enough, but the result was fatal. There was a long pause. Then Cray said, and the will? Miss Marple folded her hands. Ah, the will. Yes, it was changed. Ralston confirmed it. But Dr. Emmett didn't know whether it had been registered or not. And so, to ensure his own involvement remained hidden, he removed the figurine after Geoffrey collapsed. He had already broken it earlier days before he placed it with a near-perfect replica, sealed again. No one would have noticed if he'd removed the real one after the party. Colonel Seagrave's brow furrowed. But wouldn't he have wanted the truth to be found about the letter? No, Miss Marple said, because by the time Geoffrey collapsed, it was too late. Discovery meant inquiry. An inquiry might have led to Emmett's fingerprints on the fragments, or to someone realizing that the replica didn't quite match the original. The safest course was to vanish the object altogether and bury the truth with it. Cray nodded. Slowly, and the real figurine recovered, thanks to an anonymous note, almost certainly from Charlotte, who feared what might happen if it remained hidden. It was found behind a loose panel in the doctor's surgery, smashed, emptied, but sufficient to confirm everything. Charlotte flushed but didn't speak. Lady Diana, meanwhile, turned to her with something unreadable in her expression. You knew? I found the will, Charlotte said quietly. I didn't know about the letter. I panicked. I was afraid no one would believe I hadn't taken it, that I hadn't killed him. Lady Diana closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. I believe you, she said softly. I think I always did. The room seemed to exhale. Miss Marple gave a small smile. It's the kind that suggested more had been settled than just a mystery. That evening, the reading room emptied slowly. Colonel Seagrave was the last to leave, pausing beside Miss Marple as she rose from her chair. You know, he said, you'd have made a fine commander. cool under pressure, tactical, not easily rattled. Miss Marple chuckled. Oh, I imagine commanding a regiment and managing the Women's Institute are not all that different. One deals in strategies, and the other in rhubarb, but the people are quite the same underneath. He grunted. Okay, well, I'm glad someone saw clearly. The next morning, the villagers of High Welham awoke to a sky streaked with soft apricot and dove gray, the promise of a gentler day. The post arrived early. The tea room opened precisely at 9. The vicar's wife returned to her baking, but something had shifted. The story of Sir Geoffrey Oxley, collector, lecturer, and fallen icon no longer belonged to the village alone. It had entered the folds of whispered legend, part cautionary tale, part tragedy, and part unspoken relief. Miss Marple, returning from the greengrocer, paused on the lane to tie a loose shoelace and noticed a small envelope tucked into her garden gate. Inside, a pressed violet and a single line, written in Charlotte's unmistakable hand. Thank you for seeing what others wouldn't. Miss Marple tucked it into her coat pocket and carried on toward the cottage, the sound of bees returning to her rose beds. A week passed in that quiet, deliberate way of small English villages. High Welham did what it always did in the wake of scandal. It folded the story inward, tucked it into teacups and curtained windows, and began to behave as though nothing extraordinary had occurred at all. The Garden Society resumed its meetings. The vicar's sermon returned to Psalm 23, and at the Bluebell tea room, the return of lemon buns to the menu provoked more discussion than the confession of a local doctor ever had. But underneath it all, a subtle change had taken root. The villagers, once so enamored with Sir Geoffrey's flamboyance, now spoke of him in gentler, more cautious terms. Where once he had been called distinguished, they now opted for complicated. Where brilliant had once been the word on their lips, troubled had crept in, soft as a cough behind a handkerchief. It was not rewriting history, it was simply reframing it as only villagers could. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was returning to her usual rhythm. The garden required weeding, the mantel needed dusting, and her correspondence, mostly letters to nieces and goddaughters, had grown woefully behind. But she felt, as she always did after a case resolved, a faint unease. Not from doubts. She had no doubt Dr. Emmett was responsible for Sir Geoffrey's death. The evidence, while mostly circumstantial, had found its weight in motive, opportunity, and behavior. No dramatic chase had been required, no last-minute witness. Only a slow, precise unraveling of the threads until the center was exposed. No, the unease came not from the case itself, but from its cost. Charlotte Farlow visited on the second Tuesday after the gathering at the Historical Society. She brought a basket of apples and a tentative smile. I'm going to London, she said, after they had settled with tea in Miss Marple's sitting room. Not forever, but for a while. There's an archivist position with the British Museum. They're taking me on probation. Miss Marple smiled warmly. That sounds perfectly suited to you. Quiet rooms, orderly records, a place where what's hidden is often waiting to be catalogued. Charlotte looked down into her teacup. I'm not proud of what I did, hiding the will, running from what I found, but I'm grateful it didn't define me entirely. No action defines a person, Miss Marple said gently. Some actions offer a choice what to become afterward. Charlotte nodded. She reached into her satchel and drew out a small envelope. Something else I found just before I left Dovecote House. I wasn't sure what to do with it, but I think it belongs with you. Miss Marple opened the envelope. Inside was a torn scrap of paper, evidently once part of a longer letter bearing Sir Geoffrey's distinctive, sweeping hand. If it is ever opened, I want them to know I was trying to make it right. That the man I was in Belgium is not the man I became. Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it slowly. I believe he was telling the truth, Charlotte said. I think he was trying to change. Yes, Miss Marple said. But it is never easy to outrun the version of oneself others still believe in. Elsewhere in the village, the ripples continued. Lady Diana Reeves, now the subject of both sympathy and speculation, withdrew from public life, though not entirely. She continued to host small luncheons and retained her place on the parish council, but her tone had changed. The grand pronouncements were fewer. The disdain she once reserved for the help had softened, if only slightly. She never spoke of Sir Geoffrey again, except to say, he was difficult, wasn't he? Most agreed this was a charitable interpretation. As for Colonel Seagrave, he returned to his twice-weekly visits to the club in Lower Marchford, where he now told the story of Sir Geoffrey's downfall with a gruff, triumphant bitterness. But even he no longer claimed to have always known something was off. The truth, when finally exposed, tends to silence even the loudest of revisions. Inspector Gray, visiting Miss Marple on a blustery Thursday, stood for some time in her garden, watching the roses twitch under the wind. No appeals, he said. Emmett confessed formally. Said it was a moment of weakness, made permanent by fear. Rather poetic for a man who once sneered at poetry. Miss Marple, kneeling near her rosemary, snipped a sprig with careful fingers. He meant it. The confession? I believe he truly wanted to unburden himself. Cray glanced down at her. You always say that the difference between those who lie to hide and those who lie to survive, she said, standing with a faint wince in her knees. But the difference matters. A former can be dangerous again. The latter, usually just broken. He nodded slowly. I'm retiring, you know. Not immediately, but soon. Oh, he looked down the lane. Not because of this case. Just time. Life has to be more than chasing the dark, doesn't it? Miss Marple handed him the rosemary. Then grow something. You'll be surprised what can heal under the right soil. They shared a smile. That evening, Miss Marple lit her fire early, the sky darkening well before 6. The flicker of the flames played over the edge of her notebook, where the final page for the case had already been written and dated. But her fingers lingered there on the margins. She had solved many mysteries in her life, some small, yet this one left behind an echo, not of danger, but of sorrow, the kind that hums in the bones of an old house after the doors have closed. She thought of the figurine, carved by unknown hands, misunderstood by modern ones, and now broken, a symbol, perhaps, of what legacy meant in villages like hers. Not who people truly were, but who others believed them to be. Sir Geoffrey had lived on a pedestal and died. Quite suddenly, beneath it, Charlotte had hidden her worth until it was nearly her ruin. Dr. Emmett had taken a life not to gain power, but to defend what he believed he was owed. And Lady Diana had spent her years arranging appearances, only to discover how easily they could be rearranged before retiring. Miss Marple added one final note at the bottom of her last page. In every village, there are stories waiting to be rewritten. All it takes is one crack to let the truth seep in. She closed the notebook, placed it carefully in the drawer, and blew out the lamp. Outside, the wind had quieted, but in High Welham, as ever, the silence was only temporary. Spring returned to High Welham with all the softness of a whispered apology. Daffodils swayed by the churchyard wall, bees flirted lazily between the primroses, and washing lines once again fluttered with linens like surrender flags in a breeze. On the surface, the village had returned to normal, but even in a place so accustomed to sweeping things tidily beneath the doormat of routine, not everything had faded. Not yet. In Miss Marple's cottage, the windows were flung open to the morning air, and the scent of lemon polish and hyacinths filled the front room. Tupaia had been left to rest. Instead, Sunlight danced across the parquet floor in gold patches. On the table sat an envelope, heavy cream paper, no stamp, just her name, Miss Jane Marple, in a hand that was not unfamiliar. She knew, of course, before she opened it. Dear Miss Marple, I imagine you already know this is from me. There's no need for secrets between us now. Not truly. I did not poison Jeffrey. That part belongs to Emmett, and you saw that clearly. There's something you may have guessed and chosen not to say, and that's why I write to you now. I did find the letter inside the figurine. I did read it, and I did burn it, not to protect myself, but to protect my mother. Sir Jeffrey wasn't just my godfather. He was my father, she told me once only. Once, after too much sherry and a thunderstorm, swore me to silence. Said he'd promised to look after us quietly, and he did. Private school fees, a place at Dovecote House, a reference to the museum, but he never acknowledged me, not properly. And when I read the letter, the shame, the legacy he feared, I knew it would all come out. Everything, my mother's dignity, it's a lie of his generosity. The myth he built, I couldn't let it happen, so I burned it. That is my truth. And I thank you for never asking aloud what you had already seen. Yours, sincerely, Charlotte. Miss Marple read the letter once, then again. Her expression did not change, not even at the mention of parentage or fire. She simply folded the paper, returned it to its envelope, and tucked it into a small compartment at the back of her bureau. Not with the case notes that had been closed, teeth, but among the personal letters she kept, not for evidence, but for memory. There were many kinds of silence in the world, some born of shame, others of grief, and others still of mercy. A week later, Miss Marple stood beside the grave of Sir Geoffrey Oxley, a modest plot beneath a yew tree, its headstone fresh but unremarkable. The village had not given him a grand send-off. There were no great speeches, only a brief eulogy from the vicar and a hesitant scattering of earth. Dr. Emma's confession had ensured the legacy would always bear a shadow, but in time, that too would soften, as all things did in the countryside. She laid a single snowdrop at the base of the stone. Legacies, she said softly, are rarely what we intend them to be. Behind her, the wind stirred. That afternoon, she returned to her garden, where the roses had begun to bud, shy and tentative. The air carried the promise of warmer days, and the bees had resumed their slow work. She sat in her chair with her knitting and her notebook, and for once, she simply watched. People passed. The postmistress in her usual navy coat, the grocer's boy on his bicycle, his two elderly sisters walking their dog, who yapped at the gate as he always did. Peace had returned, but not naivety. There was now a shared understanding in High Wellham that even the most charming stories can hold secrets, that beneath polished silver and perfect manners, something far more complicated often lurks, and that, if one wishes to see it, they need only look at how people speak of the dead, not what they say, but what they do not say. That evening, Miss Marple wrote one final line in her case notebook. The figurine was never cursed, but the lies it held, those were far more dangerous. She closed the book, reached for the kettle, and as the water began to boil, she smiled, not with satisfaction, but with understanding, for there would always be another village, another tale, another secret buried in a drawing room or whispered behind a hedge, and Miss Marple, gentle and unassuming, would always be watching, not because she wished to judge, but because she listened when others didn't, and because, the quiet spaces of village life, the truth always has a voice if you know how to hear it.